My name is Stephen Finn. I'm a clinical psychologist at the Center for Therapeutic Assessment in Austin, Texas, in the United States. I learned the Rorschach over 40 years ago and is still a very important part of my assessment work with clients, in part because the Rorschach often gives me information that I am not able to get from other tests or simply from talking to clients. We have known this in psychology about the Rorschach for many years, but recent neurobiological research shows that this aspect of the Rorschach is partly due to the fact that it taps areas of the brain that are closely connected to emotions and traumatic events and memories. And there isn't another good way to get at these memories through other tests. A striking example that comes to mind is of an assessment I did a number of years ago of a 35-year-old woman who was referred to me by her therapist, who had been working with her for about 18 months. The client had come to see the therapist because she had had a series of romantic relationships where she had met men, really saw them with sort of rose-colored glasses at the beginning of their relationship, thought they were really great partners, and then they turned out to be really disturbed or narcissistic men who had swindled her, stolen money from her, and broken her heart again and again. And the client and the therapist were trying to figure out what was going wrong that she kept choosing these kind of men and wasn't able to pick up on signs earlier in the relationship that they would not be good partners. One thing they had put together was that this might have something to do with the client's early history. When she was 8 years old, her father had suicided, and they surmised that she still had a very idealized and positive view of her father because she had never had the chance to really get to know him as an adult and see his shortcomings. So their theory was that she was still kind of looking for the father she had never gotten to spend her adulthood with, and that this kept her from really having a realistic view of the men that she was dating. Among the tests that I gave her during the assessment was the Rorschach, and I have a very vivid memory of the Rorschach administration. The first part of the administration was not very noteworthy, and I noted some interesting contents in her Rorschach responses, but it was when we got to card 10 that something very different happened. I handed her card 10, and her job was to tell me what she saw there. And she had a very strong emotional reaction to the card. It could tell that it upset her a great deal, and she went kind of blank. Then, in a very small, almost childlike voice, she said, "My father's blood and brains on the wall when I found him after he had shot himself." And then she fell silent and looked kind of frozen. I was stunned, really, because although she had told me about her father's suicide and the therapist had told me about it, no one had told me that she had been the one to find him after he had killed himself. And so I helped the client sort of come back to the room, come out of the frozen place she was in, and we began to talk about this aspect of his suicide. And she told me something very interesting. She said, "I think I've always known that I was the one to find him, but I haven't thought about this or talked to anybody about it for years." Of course, after the client left, I called the therapist immediately and told her what had happened. And she too was very surprised and interested about this Rorschach event. And in the weeks after this, she and the client had a number of therapy sessions where they talked more about the father's suicide. And they were even able to have a session with the client's older sister, who was 4 years older, and talk about the events around the father's suicide. The sister verified that the client had been the one to find her father, and this is the story that came out. Apparently, the mother was quite emotionally unstable, and the father and daughter would meet after school in a small office he had behind the house. They would have tea together and talk and play, and then they would go up to the house together for dinner with the mother and the older sister. And from some things the father had written and some comments he had made, the sister and the family pieced together that the father had not wanted the mother to find him when he killed himself because he thought it would completely destabilize her and she might have to end up in an inpatient hospital. So it turns out that he had actually arranged for his daughter to find him shortly after he killed himself one afternoon when she came to his little office after school. When this information came out and the client and therapist began to talk about it, the client began to have a very different vision of her father than she had originally had, because they realized that this was actually not a very kind thing to do to the daughter, and that the father's judgment had really not been very good, and he hadn't been holding the daughter's best interests in mind. As they continued to work on this, the daughter came to see the father in a more realistic way with his strengths and shortcomings. And this had an influence on her adult romantic relationships. She began to have a more accurate perception of the men that she was dating. And about a couple of years after the assessment, I got a message from the client that she was engaged to a wonderful man, and she wanted to thank me again because she felt that her ability to have found him had a lot to do with the Rorschach assessment that we had done. And I ran into the therapist at a convention a couple months later, and she told me that she had also met this man and that she really believed that the work that we had done around the assessment had had a major influence on the clients being able to choose a good partner. So this is a very surprising and stunning Rorschach event, but I think I've seen smaller versions of this over the years with many clients. And I'm very, very grateful that I gave the Rorschach to this client and that I continue to have it as a tool that I can use with my clients.